Emotional reunion. CEO cries after seeing abandoned wife next to twins after 5 years. Welcome to another beautiful tale. I know you've been waiting for this video. Did you wait for the clock to strike 2 p.m.? Before we begin, tell me your beautiful name. Are you a regular viewer or new to our channel? Subscribe and let's start. The crisp October wind whirled through the tree-lined paths of Central Park, scattering golden leaves in its wake. It was 2015, and New York City was alive with the electric energy that always seemed to pulse through its veins during autumn. Mabel Bennett clutched her portfolio closer to her chest, her heels clicking against the pavement as she rushed toward her next client meeting. At 32, she had built a respectable career as an interior designer, transforming Manhattan's most prestigious apartments into works of art. Her midnight blue dress fluttered in the breeze as she navigated the winding path, her thoughts consumed by the upcoming presentation. The Anderson project was her biggest opportunity yet, a complete renovation of a Fifth Avenue penthouse. Success could catapult her small design firm into the upper echelons of New York's competitive interior design world. Lost in thought, she didn't notice the tall figure rounding the corner until it was too late. The collision sent her portfolio flying, papers scattering like confetti in the autumn breeze. Her coffee cup hit the ground, creating a small brown river between them. "Oh God, I'm so sorry!" she exclaimed, dropping to her knees to gather the scattered designs. Her heart raced as she watched months of work dance away on the wind. "Please let me help," a deep voice responded. As she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. The man before her was striking, tall and distinguished in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled, and despite the situation, he maintained an air of calm sophistication. "I'm Bram," he said, efficiently gathering papers while somehow managing to avoid the spilled coffee. Bram Benson. The name hit her like a second collision. Everyone in New York's business world knew of Bram Benson, the CEO of Benson Enterprises, one of the city's most successful real estate development companies. His face had graced countless business magazines, and his projects had reshaped the city's skyline. "Mabel Bennett," she managed to reply, trying to maintain her composure while internally cringing at the situation. "I'm so sorry about this. I should have been watching where I was going." "Nonsense," he said, his smile warming his entire face. "I was equally distracted. Quarterly reports have a way of consuming one's attention." He paused, examining one of her sketches before handing it back. "These are extraordinary. Your work." Mabel nodded, surprised by his interest. "Yes, I'm an interior designer. These are for a project I'm presenting this afternoon." "The Anderson penthouse on Fifth?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Now it was her turn to be surprised. "How did you know?" "Because Benson Enterprises owns the building," he chuckled, "and I've heard wonderful things about your firm from the Andersons, though I must say, seeing these designs in person, they didn't do your talent justice." A blush crept across her cheeks as she accepted the last few papers from him. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected spark through her body. "Thank you, Mr. Benson." "Please call me Bram," he insisted, helping her to her feet. "And please let me replace your coffee. It's the least I can do." "Oh, that's not necessary," she protested, but he was already shaking his head. "I insist. Besides, I'd love to hear more about your vision for the Anderson project. There's a charming little cafe just around the corner that makes the best cappuccino in Manhattan." Something in his voice made her pause. There was genuine interest there, yes, but something more, a warmth that seemed to reach out and wrap around her like a comfortable blanket. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. "I suppose I have a little time before my presentation," she said, checking her watch. "Excellent," he beamed, gesturing toward the path. Shall we? As they walked, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, casting dappled shadows through the trees. Mabel couldn't help but notice how Bram naturally adjusted his stride to match hers, how he positioned himself between her and the street as they left the park, the way he subtly guided her with a gentle hand at the small of her back when they crossed busy intersections. The cafe was indeed charming, a small, French-inspired establishment with wrought-iron tables and the rich aroma of freshly ground coffee beans perfuming the air. Bram pulled out her chair with old-world courtesy, and for the next hour they talked about everything and nothing. He asked intelligent questions about her designs, sharing his own passion for architecture and urban development. She found herself captivated by his vision for sustainable city growth and his genuine desire to preserve New York's historic character while pushing it into the future. "You know," he said as they finished their second round of coffee, "I have a project I'd love to get your opinion on. We're converting an old warehouse in Brooklyn into luxury lofts, but we want to maintain its industrial heritage while creating truly unique living spaces." "That sounds fascinating," Mabel replied, genuinely intrigued. "It's always a delicate balance, preserving the soul of a building while making it functional for modern life." "Exactly." His eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Would you be interested in taking a look? Perhaps over dinner tomorrow night? I could have my driver pick you up, and we could review the plans before heading to this fantastic little Italian place I know in Brooklyn Heights." The invitation hung in the air between them, and Mabel felt her heart skip a beat. This was more than a business meeting. They both knew it. The way he looked at her, the warmth in his voice, the slight uncertainty in his expression as he waited for her answer. It all spoke of something more personal. "I'd love to," she heard herself say, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. His smile could have lit up the entire city. "Wonderful. 7 o'clock?" As they exchanged contact information, their hands brushed again, and this time neither pulled away immediately. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Finally, Mabel glanced at her watch and jumped up. "Oh, the Anderson presentation! I need to go!" "Let me have my driver take you," Bram offered, already pulling out his phone. No, it's just a few blocks away. I'll walk. Thank you for the coffee and everything." "Thank you for running into me," he replied with a wink. "It's not every day a beautiful woman literally falls into my path." As Mabel hurried toward her meeting, her portfolio clutched tightly to her chest. She couldn't help but smile. The morning's disaster had somehow transformed into something magical, something that felt like the beginning of an extraordinary story. What she couldn't know then was just how extraordinary that story would become, filled with soaring heights of joy and crushing depths of despair, with love so pure it could move mountains and betrayal sharp enough to shatter worlds. But in that moment, walking through the golden autumn light of Manhattan, all she knew was that something wonderful had begun. That evening, as she sat in her small but elegant apartment overlooking the city lights, her phone buzzed with a message from Bram. "Just wanted to make sure you caught your breath after all that running today. Looking forward to tomorrow. Sweet dreams, Mabel." She held the phone to her chest, feeling like a teenager with her first crush. The Anderson presentation had gone perfectly. They had loved her designs and signed the contract on the spot. But somehow, that wasn't even the most memorable part of her day. As she got ready for bed, she couldn't help but think about how one simple collision had changed the course of her day, and perhaps her life. The last thought she had before drifting off to sleep was of kind eyes crinkling at the corners and the warmth of an unexpected touch. Little did she know, across town in his penthouse office, Bram Benson sat at his desk, quarterly reports forgotten, thinking about a chance encounter in Central Park and the way destiny sometimes arrives disguised as accident. Chapter 2. The Path to Forever. The New York winter melted into spring. marking 6 months since that fateful collision in Central Park. What began as a business dinner discussing the Brooklyn warehouse project had blossomed into something neither Mabel nor Bram could have anticipated. Their first real date had set the tone for their whirlwind romance. After reviewing the architectural plans over wine and pasta in Brooklyn Heights, they had walked along the promenade, the Manhattan skyline glittering across the East River like 1,000 stars brought down to earth. "Each of those lights represents a story," Bram had said, leaning against the railing. "Millions of lives, millions of dreams, all playing out in this magnificent city." "And which light is your story?" Mabel had asked, drawing closer to him in the chilly evening air. "The one that just got considerably brighter," he'd replied, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. That evening had set the pattern for countless others. Despite running a billion-dollar empire, Bram made time for Mabel almost every day. Sometimes it was just coffee in her office while she worked on designs. Other times it was elaborate surprises like whisking her away for a weekend in the Hamptons or arranging private viewings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art after hours. Sarah, Mabel's best friend since college, watched it all with equal parts joy and protective concern. "It's like a fairy tale," she said one afternoon over lunch. "But are you sure it's not too fast?" Mabel had smiled, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "You know how sometimes you read a book, and from the first page, you just know it's going to be extraordinary. That's what this feels like. Every moment with Bram feels like turning another page in exactly the story I was meant to read." Their relationship deepened through small moments as much as grand gestures. Bram learned that Mabel hummed while she sketched, usually old Beatles songs her father had loved. She discovered that despite his powerful exterior, he was terribly ticklish and had a secret passion for science fiction novels. They shared their fears, their dreams, their pasts. One particularly memorable evening, they sat in his penthouse office long after everyone else had gone home. Mabel was curled up on the leather sofa, watching him work. "Tell me about your parents," she'd said softly, noticing how he always kept their photo on his desk. Bram had set down his papers, his eyes growing distant. They were extraordinary people. Dad built this company from nothing, but he never let success change who he was. Mom was a concert pianist. That's where my love of music comes from. They had the kind of marriage that made you believe in forever. What happened to them? Plane crash 10 years ago. Private jet malfunction over the Atlantic. His voice had caught slightly. "I was 30, already working as CEO, but suddenly everything felt different. The empire felt hollow without them to share it with." Mabel had crossed the room then, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "They'd be proud of you, Bram, not just of what you've built, but of who you are." He turned in his chair, pulling her onto his lap. "I wish they could have met you. Mom would have loved your spirit, your creativity. Dad would have appreciated your business sense, and probably would have tried to steal you away to redesign all our properties." Moments like these wove themselves into the fabric of their relationship, creating something stronger than mere romance. They challenged each other, supported each other, made each other better. Their love affected everyone around them. Bram's executive assistant, Margaret, who had worked for him for 15 years, told Mabel privately that she'd never seen him so happy. "He used to live at the office," she confided. "Now he actually leaves at reasonable hours. He smiles more. You've brought him back to life." Mabel's small design firm flourished under the subtle support of Bram's connections, though he was careful never to overshadow her own talents. When she landed a major contract to redesign a chain of luxury hotels, he celebrated her success as if it were his own, throwing a surprise party for her entire team. The night of the opera began like many others. Bram had always shared his love of music with Mabel, teaching her about composers, helping her understand the stories behind the great arias. But tonight felt different from the moment his car picked her up. Sarah had helped her get ready, insisting on the emerald green gown that made her eyes sparkle. "Trust me," she'd said with a mysterious smile. "Tonight needs to be perfect." The Metropolitan Opera House glowed like a jewel as they arrived. Bram seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, so unlike his usual confident self. In their private box, decorated with twinkling lights and roses, he kept touching his pocket when he thought she wasn't looking. As La Bohème unfolded below them, Mabel found herself more aware of Bram than the performance. The way his hand held hers a little tighter than usual. The way his eyes kept finding her face instead of the stage. The barely perceptible tremor in his fingers as he poured their champagne during intermission. When the spotlight suddenly swung to their box during the final act, Mabel's heart nearly stopped. The next few minutes became a blur of emotion as Bram dropped to one knee, speaking words that seemed to come straight from his soul. "Mabel," his voice carried clearly through the hushed theatre, "before you, I was building a legacy of steel and glass, but you've shown me how to build something far more precious, a life filled with love, with joy, with purpose. When I'm with you, even the grandest opera pales in comparison to the music in my heart." Tears streamed down her face as he opened the vintage ring box, revealing his grandmother's emerald ring. "Will you write the rest of our story with me? Will you make my life your masterpiece? Will you marry me?" Her "yes" echoed through the opera house, followed by thunderous applause as rose petals showered down around them. But in that moment, they were alone in their own world, sealing their promise with a kiss that felt like destiny. The celebration that followed at their favorite restaurant was filled with loved ones who had all kept the secret. Sarah hugged her tightly, whispering, "Now you know why I insisted on the green dress. It matches your ring." As they danced their first dance as an engaged couple, Bram sang softly in her ear, his rich baritone matching the melody of their song. "I've been planning this for months," he admitted. "I wanted it to be as extraordinary as you are." "It's perfect," she whispered back. "But you could have proposed in a paper bag in the rain, and it still would have been perfect because it's you." The night ended where their story began, in Central Park. Standing in the exact spot where they'd collided 6 months earlier, Bram pulled her close. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I believe in us," she replied, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Everything else is just details." As they shared one more kiss under the stars, neither could have imagined the storms that lay ahead. In that moment, their love seemed invulnerable, their future as bright as the diamonds that surrounded the emerald on Mabel's finger. Later that night, as Mabel lay in bed looking at her ring, she thought about the journey that had brought them here. From a chance collision to this moment, every step had felt both surprising and inevitable. Like a dance, they'd always known the steps to, even though they'd never danced it before. She didn't know then about the trials that would test their love, the betrayals that would threaten to tear them apart, or the strength they would need to find their way back to each other. In that moment, she knew only the pure joy of loving and being loved, of finding the other half of her soul in the most unexpected way. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Bram's words, "We're going to build something extraordinary together." Little did she know just how prophetic and how challenging those words would prove to be. Chapter 3. Love's True Test. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Upper East Side penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Mabel stirred her coffee absently, watching Bram as he paced the length of their living room, phone pressed to his ear. The furrows in his brow had grown deeper over the past few weeks, and the shadows under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights she pretended not to notice. "No, that's unacceptable," he was saying, his voice tight with controlled tension. We need those permits expedited. The Rogers project can't wait another... I understand, but... He fell silent, listening, and Mabel saw his shoulders slump slightly. It had started 3 months ago, with whispers of a market downturn. At first, it seemed like nothing more than the usual economic fluctuations. But then the dominoes began to fall, major construction projects stalled, investors pulled out, and the real estate market started to crumble. Bram ended the call and stood motionless, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. His skyline, the one he'd helped shape over the years. Mabel approached quietly, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "That bad?" she asked softly. He covered her hands with his own, his wedding ring cool against her skin. "Worse. The Rogers Group is pulling out of the Brooklyn development. Without their backing..." He shook his head. "It's not just that project, Mabel. It's everything. The market's in freefall, and we're overextended. We have too many projects mid-development, too much tied up in properties that are suddenly worth half what they were 6 months ago." "There must be something we can do," she said, tightening her embrace. He turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real fear in his eyes. "I've tried everything. Called in every favor, leveraged every connection. The banks won't extend any more credit. Our investors are running scared. If we can't secure significant capital within the next 2 weeks..." His voice trailed off. "What happens in 2 weeks? We default on our loans. The company goes into receivership. Everything my father built, everything I've built..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Mabel felt her heart constrict. She knew what Benson Enterprises meant to Bram. It wasn't just a company, it was his heritage, his father's legacy. And now it was crumbling. That night, as Bram finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Mabel lay awake, her mind racing. The solution had been there all along, but she'd been avoiding it. In her bedside drawer lay the deed to Bennett Estate, her family's sprawling property in Connecticut. The historic mansion and its 100 acres had been in her family for generations. Her parents had left it to her with one request: "Keep it in the family, darling. This place is your heritage, your security." The property was worth millions, free and clear, no mortgages or liens, enough to save Benson Enterprises. The next morning, she made the call to her family's lawyer before she could change her mind. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Miss Bennett?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice heavy with concern. "Your parents were very specific about wanting you to keep the estate. They also taught me that love means doing what's right, no matter how hard it is," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Have the papers ready by this afternoon." When Bram came home that evening, looking more defeated than ever, Mabel was waiting in his office. A thick envelope lay on his desk. "What's this?" he asked wearily. "The solution," she said simply. "I sold Bennett Estate." He stared at her, uncomprehending for a moment, then his eyes widened with horror as understanding dawned. "Number absolutely not. Mabel, that estate is your inheritance, your security. Your parents would understand." She cut him off gently. "They knew what real love means. This company is your heritage, Bram. It's part of who you are. I won't watch it be destroyed when I have the means to save it." "But darling, your parents left this for your future," he protested, his voice breaking. Mabel stepped forward, taking his face in her hands. "You are my future," she said firmly. "We'll rebuild together. Money comes and goes, but what we have is priceless." "I'll pay you back," he whispered, pulling her close. "Every penny with interest." She shook her head against his chest. "This isn't a loan, it's a gift. Our marriage isn't about keeping score. What's mine is yours, remember?" The next few weeks were a blur of activity as Bram used the capital from the estate sale to stabilize the company. Slowly, the crisis began to ease. Projects resumed, investors regained confidence, and Benson Enterprises not only survived, but emerged stronger. But something had changed between them, not for the worse, but in a deep, fundamental way. Bram looked at Mabel differently now, with a kind of awe that went beyond love. He understood now the depth of her commitment, the true meaning of partnership. Late one night, months later, they stood on their balcony, looking out over the city lights. Bram wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close against the autumn chill. "I've been thinking about your parents," he said softly, "about what they would say if they could see us now." Mabel leaned back against him, remembering her father's laugh, her mother's gentle wisdom. They would say that a house is just a house, but a home is wherever love lives. "We'll build a new estate," Bram promised, "something even more beautiful, filled with our own memories." She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face. "We already have everything we need. You taught me that success isn't about buildings or bank accounts. It's about having someone to share it with." As they stood there under the stars, their love seemed stronger than ever, tempered by sacrifice and strengthened by adversity. Neither could know that this crisis was just the beginning, that their love would face even greater tests in the months to come. But in that moment, watching the city lights twinkle like earthbound stars, they were simply two people who had chosen each other above all else, who understood that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of one's love. Later that night, as Mabel drifted off to sleep in Bram's arms, she thought about her parents' estate, the grand old house with its secret gardens and hidden corners, the place where she'd grown up. She felt no regret, only a deep sense of peace. Some sacrifices aren't sacrifices at all, she realized, when they're made for love. What she couldn't know was that this act of sacrifice would make the betrayal to come all the more bitter, the pain all the more acute. But that was still in the future, and for now she slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she had chosen love over everything else, just as her parents had taught her to do. Chapter 4. When Joy Meets Shadows. The first signs were subtle. Mabel might have missed them if she hadn't been so attuned to her body's changes lately. The morning fatigue that coffee couldn't shake, the sudden aversion to her favorite perfume, the way certain foods that she once loved now turned her stomach. As she sat in her doctor's waiting room on that bright spring morning, her heart raced with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Dr. Sarah Chen, her longtime physician and coincidentally her best friend's sister, confirmed what Mabel had begun to suspect. "Congratulations," she said warmly, looking up from the test results. "You're about 8 weeks pregnant." Mabel's hands flew to her stomach, tears of joy springing to her eyes. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Dr. Chen smiled, then paused, studying her screen more closely. "And Mabel, there's something else you should know." Her heart skipped a beat. "Is everything okay?" "More than okay. I'm seeing 2 distinct heartbeats. You're carrying twins." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Twins. The word echoed in her mind like a beautiful melody. She thought of Bram, how his face would light up at the news. He'd always talked about wanting a big family, and now they would have an instant one. "Would you like to hear their heartbeats?" Dr. Chen asked, already reaching for the ultrasound equipment. The sound filled the room. 2 rapid, strong rhythms, slightly out of sync with each other, creating a magical percussion that brought fresh tears to Mabel's eyes. She recorded it on her phone, wanting to share this moment with Bram. The drive home from the doctor's office felt surreal. The city seemed different somehow, as if it had been transformed by the knowledge that she was carrying 2 precious lives within her. She touched her still flat stomach, marveling at the miracle growing there. But as she approached their penthouse, her joy was tempered by concern. Bram had been different lately. The changes had been gradual at first. Missed dinner dates, curt responses to her messages, an increasing tendency to work late into the night. She'd attributed it to stress, remembering how the financial crisis had affected him. But lately, there was something else, a coldness she couldn't explain. Just last night, he'd snapped at her over something trivial. She'd moved some papers on his desk while tidying up. His reaction had been disproportionate, almost frightening in its intensity. When she'd tried to apologize, he'd walked away, locking himself in his study for the rest of the evening. Still, today would be different. This news would bring back her Bram, the man who'd proposed so romantically at the opera, who'd looked at her with such love when she'd saved his company. This would remind him of what really mattered. She spent the afternoon preparing a special dinner, setting their formal dining room with their best china and crystal. She placed the ultrasound photos in a small silver frame, a gift she'd bought on impulse during her lunch break, and wrapped it carefully. At 6 o'clock she texted him, "Coming home for dinner? I have wonderful news to share." His response came an hour later, "Working late, don't wait up." Mabel stood in their beautifully decorated dining room, staring at her phone. The candles she'd lit were burning low, the carefully prepared meal growing cold. Something inside her cracked a little, but she pushed the feeling aside. He was busy. It was just bad timing. She waited up anyway, curled in their bedroom window seat, watching the city lights twinkle below. It was after midnight when she heard the elevator doors open. His footsteps were unsteady as he made his way down the hallway. "Bram," she called softly, stepping into the corridor. "Are you all right?" He stood there, his tie loosened, a strange look in his eyes. "Why are you still up?" "I wanted to tell you something important." She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "I'm tired, Mabel. Whatever it is can wait until morning." "But I said it can wait." His voice echoed off the marble floors, making her flinch. He'd never raised his voice to her before. The smell of unfamiliar perfume drifted from his suit jacket as he brushed past her. Mabel stood frozen in the hallway, one hand pressed to her stomach where their babies grew, the other still holding the wrapped ultrasound frame. She didn't sleep that night, lying awake listening to Bram's breathing from the guest room where he'd chosen to sleep. When had things started to go so wrong? When had the man who'd once looked at her like she was his whole world begun to look through her as if she were a stranger? Morning brought no answers. Bram was gone before she woke, his side of the bed untouched. On the kitchen counter, she found a note in his familiar handwriting. "Had an early meeting. Don't know when I'll be home." Mabel sat at their breakfast bar, surrounded by the trappings of their perfect life. The designer kitchen he'd had renovated to her exact specifications, the view of Central Park that had made her gasp the first time she'd seen it, the photos of their happy times that lined the walls. But now it all felt hollow, like a stage set for a play where the actors had forgotten their lines. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found Sarah's number. Her finger hovered over the call button, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. How could she explain what was happening when she didn't understand it herself? Instead, she got dressed and went to her design studio. Work had always been her sanctuary, and today she needed that more than ever. But even there, surrounded by fabric swatches and blueprints, she couldn't focus. The joy of her pregnancy news had turned bitter in her mouth, like wine gone to vinegar. Late that afternoon, she gathered her courage and went to Bram's office. His assistant Margaret gave her a strange look as she approached. Was it pity? "He's in a meeting," Margaret said, not quite meeting her eyes. "He left strict instructions not to be disturbed." "I'm his wife," Mabel said quietly, "and I'm carrying his children. I think that earns me the right to disturb him." Margaret's eyes widened at the news, but before she could respond, Bram's office door opened. He stood there, his face thunderous. "I told you no interruptions," he snapped at Margaret, then turned his cold gaze to Mabel. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk, Bram. Something's wrong, and we need to fix it." "I'm not now," he cut her off. "I have important clients waiting. More important than your wife, than our future." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a glimpse of the man she'd married. But it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Go home, Mabel. We'll talk later." But they didn't talk later. He didn't come home that night or the next. The ultrasound photos remained wrapped in their silver frame, the recording of their baby's heartbeats unplayed on her phone. A week passed, then 2. Bram's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He'd come home late, reeking of alcohol and strange perfume, his words cutting when he spoke to her at all. The man who had once written her poetry and surprised her with midnight picnics in their rooftop garden now barely acknowledged her presence. The morning sickness came in waves, but Mabel suffered through it alone, holding her hair back in their marble bathroom, tears mixing with the bitter taste in her mouth. She thought about their babies, growing stronger every day, unaware of the storm brewing around them. One particularly bad morning, as she knelt on the cold tile floor, she felt a gentle hand on her back. For a moment her heart leaped, thinking Bram had finally noticed, finally cared. But it was just Marina, their housekeeper, her weathered face creased with concern. "Mi niña," Marina susurró, ayudándola a levantarse. "You must tell him." "I've tried," Mabel said, wiping her mouth with a trembling hand. "He won't listen. He won't even look at me anymore." Marina's dark eyes filled with something that looked like fear. "Something is not right, Senora. The phone calls, the late nights, there are whispers among the staff." "Whispers about what?" But Marina just shook her head, making the sign of the cross. "Be careful, mi niña. Protect yourself. Protect those babies." That night, Mabel sat in their darkened living room waiting. The twins were restless, as if they could sense her distress. She placed both hands on her stomach, whispering soothing words to them. When Bram finally came home, she was ready. "We need to talk," she said, turning on the lamp beside her. "Now." He stood in the doorway, his silhouette harsh against the hallway light. "I told you. I'm tired." "I'm pregnant," she said simply. "With twins." The silence that followed was deafening. She watched his face, waiting for joy, shock, any emotion at all. Instead, his expression turned to stone. "Is that supposed to change anything?" The words hit her like physical blows. She stood shakily, one hand still protectively over her stomach. "Change anything? Bram, these are our children, the family we talked about, dreamed about." "Dreams change," he said coldly. "People change." "What's happened to you?" she whispered. "What's happened to us?" He turned away, heading for his study. "Go to bed, Mabel. I have work to do." She stood there in the half-dark, feeling the world she'd built with this man crumbling around her. Outside, a spring storm was gathering, lightning illuminating the city in harsh bursts. It seemed fitting. Her own perfect life was about to be torn apart by a storm she hadn't seen coming. What she couldn't know then was that this was just the beginning. The real storm, the betrayal that would shatter her world completely, was still to come. But for now, she stood alone in their beautiful home, one hand pressed to her stomach where their babies grew, and whispered a promise to them. "No matter what happens, my darlings, you will be loved, you will be protected, you will know joy, even if I have to create it from the ashes of my own broken heart." Thunder rolled across the city, and somewhere in the darkness a clock struck midnight, marking the end of one chapter of their story, and the beginning of something darker, something that would test the very limits of love's endurance. Chapter 5. Webs of Deception. Maria Delgado had worked in the Benson household for 25 years, long enough to see the mansion's halls change from echoing emptiness after Bram's parents died to the warmth Mabel had brought with her arrival. For years, she had been more than a maid. She had been a confidant, a surrogate mother figure, a keeper of secrets. But now, as she stood in Mabel's private sitting room, caught red-handed, with her employer's jewelry box, she felt those decades of trust crumbling like sand. "Maria?" Mabel's voice was soft with disbelief. "What are you doing?" The elderly maid's hands trembled as she set down the antique box. The emerald earrings Bram had given Mabel for their first anniversary glinted accusingly in the afternoon light. "Senora, please," Maria's voice cracked. "My grandson, Miguel, he needs surgery. The doctors, they say without it." Tears streamed down her weathered face. "I have served this family for 25 years. Please, don't tell Mr. Benson." Mabel moved closer, her pregnancy now visible in the gentle swell of her belly beneath her silk blouse. "Why didn't you come to us? You know we would have helped." "I tried, Senora. I went to Mr. Benson last week, but he—" Maria hesitated, something dark flashing behind her eyes. "He said there was no money for such things anymore." Mabel frowned. The company had recovered well from its financial crisis, thanks to her sacrifice of the family estate. There should have been no issue with helping Maria, whom Bram had always treated like family. "Don't worry about the jewelry," Mabel said gently. "I'll help with Miguel's surgery. We can arrange everything tomorrow." But as she reached out to comfort the older woman, she noticed something strange in Maria's expression. A calculation that didn't match her tears, a hardness that didn't belong in the eyes of someone who had just been shown mercy. Later that evening, as Mabel prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The incident with Maria felt off, like a false note in a familiar song. She was about to call Sarah to discuss it when she heard voices from Bram's study. "It's done," Maria's voice, but different, cold, businesslike. "She caught me, just as we planned." "And?" Bram's voice, equally unfamiliar in its tone. "She reacted exactly as you said she would, all kindness and forgiveness. She suspects nothing." Mabel froze in the hallway, one hand flying to her mouth to stifle her gasp, the other instinctively protecting her unborn twins. "Good," Bram continued. "Everything's in place for tomorrow, then. The photographer will arrive at 2, when she's usually in her bath. You'll let him in, show him to her room. Make sure the photos are convincing. And my payment, once it's done, once I have what I need to end this marriage without losing everything." The world tilted on its axis. Mabel gripped the wall for support, her mind refusing to process what she was hearing. This was a nightmare. It had to be. But the voices continued, discussing details of their plan with cold precision. Maria, whom she had loved like a mother, was helping Bram orchestrate her destruction. But why? What had changed in her husband to make him want to destroy not just their marriage, but her very dignity? The next day unfolded like a twisted play where Mabel was both actor and audience. She went through her morning routine mechanically, her mind racing with plans. At 1:30, instead of preparing for her usual bath, she sat in her bedroom, waiting. The knock came at 2 exactly. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The man who entered was exactly as she had overheard them describe, tall, well-dressed, conventionally handsome. He played his part perfectly, apologizing for the mix-up, claiming he had the wrong address for a photography session. But Mabel saw the camera he tried to hide, saw the way his eyes darted around the room, looking for compromising angles. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said clearly, making sure her voice would carry to the recording device she'd hidden earlier. "I think you should leave." He retreated smoothly, professionally, but Mabel caught the flash of frustration in his eyes. The plan had failed, or so she thought. What she didn't know was that Maria had been taking photos through the partially open door, photos that, when carefully edited, would tell a very different story than the truth. Photos that would give Bram exactly what he wanted. That evening, as Mabel prepared to confront her husband with what she knew, she felt the first sharp pain in her abdomen. By the time Bram came home, she was doubled over, blood staining her dress. The babies, she gasped. Something's wrong with our babies. For a moment, just a moment, she saw real fear in Bram's eyes, a flash of the man she had married. But then it was gone, replaced by that terrible coldness. "I'll call you a car," he said, already turning away. "A car?" she whispered in disbelief. "Bram, these are your children." "Are they?" he asked, his voice like ice. "How can I be sure of anything anymore?" The words hit her like physical blows. Through the haze of pain and fear, Mabel finally understood. This had been his plan all along. Not just to end their marriage, but to destroy her completely, to paint her as unfaithful, to deny their children. Sarah found her an hour later, crumpled on the marble floor of their foyer, blood pooling beneath her. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and urgent voices. The last thing Mabel remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of 2 strong heartbeats on the monitor, her babies, fighting to survive just as she would have to fight. In her hospital room, as dawn broke over the city, Mabel made a decision. The doctors had saved the twins, but she knew she had to save herself and them from whatever darkness had consumed their father. With Sarah's help, she packed a small bag. By noon, she had disappeared from the hospital, from New York, from the life she had built with a man who had become a stranger. As her train pulled out of Penn Station, bound for Baltimore, Mabel touched her stomach gently. "It's just us now, my darlings," she whispered, "but we'll be okay. We'll be more than okay." She didn't look back at the city skyline fading behind her. She couldn't know then that the truth would eventually come to light, that Maria's conscience would finally break, that Bram would spend years searching for redemption. In that moment, all she knew was that love, real love, meant being strong enough to walk away when staying would destroy you. The train rushed south, carrying Mabel and her unborn children toward an uncertain future. Behind her, in the city she had called home, a web of lies was already beginning to unravel, but that was a chapter of the story she wasn't ready to read yet. Chapter 6. A New Beginning. The Baltimore apartment was a far cry from her Manhattan penthouse, 600 square feet on the 3rd floor of a weathered brick building in Hampton, with creaking hardwood floors and a window unit that rattled when the summer heat forced it into overtime. But to Mabel, it was sanctuary. She stood at the single window of her new home, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. At 5 months pregnant, her belly had become pronounced enough that strangers on the street would smile and offer their seats on the bus. The twins were active today, as if they could sense their mother's reflective mood. "I know, my darlings," she whispered, running her hands over her stomach. "It's not what we're used to, but it's ours." The first month had been the hardest. Despite her successful career in New York, starting over in a new city while pregnant with twins had proven challenging. She had arrived with only a small suitcase of clothes, her laptop, and her professional portfolio, leaving behind the life she'd built, the luxury she'd grown accustomed to, and the man who had once been her everything. Sarah had helped, of course. Her best friend had connections in Baltimore's design community and had made some discreet calls. But Mabel had insisted on making her own way, taking a junior position at a small but respectable design firm. Her new colleagues didn't need to know that she had once designed penthouses for New York's elite. "Mrs. Thompson," her neighbor's voice called through the thin walls. "Everything all right in there?" Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman next door, had appointed herself Mabel's unofficial guardian. She had noticed Mabel's pregnancy on the day she moved in and had been bringing over homemade soup and gentle advice ever since. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen," Mabel called back. "Just talking to the babies." There was a pause, then a soft knock at her door. When Mabel opened it, Mrs. Chen stood there with a covered dish and knowing eyes. "Talking to babies is good," she said, shuffling in without waiting for an invitation. "But talking to other people also good, especially when eating my dumplings." Mabel smiled, accepting both the food and the company. She had learned that in this modest building, neighbors weren't just people who shared walls. They were a community. Mrs. Chen from 3B with her dumplings and wisdom, Mr. Rodriguez from 2A who fixed her air conditioning without charging a penny, young Katie from 4C who walked with her to the bus stop each morning. They sat at Mabel's small kitchen table, steam rising from the dumplings between them. Mrs. Chen watched as Mabel ate, nodding approvingly. "Babies need strength," she said. "Mother too. You work too hard." It was true. Mabel had thrown herself into her new job, determined to prove herself again. Her designs were already gaining attention, though she was careful to keep a low profile. She couldn't risk Bram finding her. Not until the twins were born, not until she had built something solid here. "I need to work," Mabel replied. "The babies will be here in 4 months, and I have to be ready." Mrs. Chen's eyes softened. "You run from something bad," she said. "It wasn't a question. I see it in your eyes. Same look my daughter had when she left her first husband." Mabel set down her chopsticks, surprised by the sudden tears in her eyes. She hadn't told anyone here her real story. To her neighbors and colleagues, she was just Mrs. Thompson, a widow starting fresh. "I thought I knew him," she whispered. "I thought what we had was real." Mrs. Chen reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Mabel's. "Real love not try to break you. Real love make you stronger." As if in agreement, one of the twins kicked sharply, making Mabel gasp and then laugh. She guided Mrs. Chen's hand to the spot. "See?" Mrs. Chen smiled. "Babies already strong, like mother. They know they are loved." Later that night, after Mrs. Chen had gone home and the city sounds had quieted to a gentle hum, Mabel sat at her small desk, working on a design for a local restaurant renovation. Her new firm might not handle million-dollar projects, but there was something satisfying about creating beautiful spaces for regular people, about making dreams accessible. Her phone buzzed. Sarah, checking in as she did every evening. "The private investigator called again," Sarah texted. "Bram's still looking for you." Mabel's hand trembled as she typed her response. "Don't tell him anything. Please. Never. But the photos." Maria confessed to one of the other staff. The whole thing was a setup. Mabel closed her eyes, one hand going protectively to her belly. She had suspected as much, had overheard enough that terrible day to know she'd been betrayed. But confirmation still hurt. "It doesn't matter anymore," she replied. "We're safe here, building a new life." Her tiny apartment suddenly felt like a fortress, protecting her and her unborn children from the chaos they'd left behind. She looked around at the second-hand furniture she'd carefully selected, the small nursery area she was gradually setting up in the corner of her bedroom, the design books and fabric samples spread across her desk. It wasn't grand, but it was honest, real. The next morning, she woke early to watch the sunrise from her window. The twins were usually active at this hour, and she had made it their special time together. "Let me tell you about strength," she whispered to them as the sky lightened. "It's not about having everything. It's about building something from nothing. It's about getting up every morning and choosing to move forward, even when your heart wants to look back." A soft kick responded, first one, then the other, as if they were taking turns listening to their mother's voice. "Your father—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father lost his way. But that doesn't mean you won't be loved. You'll have me, and I promise you'll have a community of people who will show you what real love looks like." As if on cue, there was a knock at her door. Katie from 4C, right on time for their morning walk. Mr. Rodriguez's voice, carried up from the street where he was already working on someone's car, singing along to old Spanish songs. Mrs. Chen's window opened above, the smell of brewing tea drifting down. Mabel touched her belly one more time before getting ready to face the day. "See, we're going to be just fine." She couldn't know then that across the city, in a small law office, papers were being filed that would eventually lead Bram to them. She couldn't know that Maria's conscience would finally break, that the truth would come to light in ways she never expected. She couldn't know that this simple life she was building would become her strength when the storms returned. But for now, in the gentle light of dawn, Mabel felt peace settle over her like a warm blanket. She had lost a fortune in New York, but here in Baltimore, in this modest apartment with her unborn children and her newfound community, she was discovering something far more valuable, the wealth of authenticity, the richness of true belonging. "Time for work, my darlings," she said, gathering her portfolio. "We have a life to build." Chapter 7. As Truth Unravels. The twins' first cry echoed through the Baltimore General Hospital delivery room on a stormy October night. Hope came first, announcing her arrival with a fierce determination that would come to define her. Grace followed 3 minutes later, her softer cry a gentle counterpoint to her sister's. "They're perfect, Doctor," Martinez announced, placing the swaddled bundles in Mabel's trembling arms. 2 healthy girls. Through tears of joy and exhaustion, Mabel studied their tiny faces. Hope had Bram's strong chin and dark hair, while Grace inherited her mother's delicate features and auburn curls. Both had their father's striking blue eyes, a detail that made Mabel's heart clench even as it filled her with wonder. Mrs. Chen, who had insisted on being there for the birth, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Strong babies," she declared, "like mother." In the days that followed, Mabel's small apartment became a cocoon of new life and endless love. Her neighbors rallied around her with the kind of support she'd never expected. Mrs. Chen appeared daily with homemade bone broth and practical advice. Mr. Rodriguez installed better locks on her doors and a security camera system, refusing payment. Katie from 4C organized a schedule among the younger residents to help with laundry and groceries. "It takes a village," Katie said one afternoon, folding tiny onesies while Mabel nursed the twins. "And you're part of our village now." But even as Mabel built this new life with her daughters, events were unfolding in New York that would soon shatter her careful reconstruction. In Manhattan, Bram Benson sat in his darkened office, staring at the skyline he'd helped shape. The past 6 months had aged him a decade. The loss of Mabel, the knowledge of his unborn children, the growing suspicion that he'd been manipulated, it all weighed on him like a physical burden. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. Margaret, his longtime assistant, entered without waiting for a response. "You need to see this," she said, placing a USB drive on his desk. "Security footage from the day of the incident. I've been trying to access it for months, but someone had encrypted it. The tech team finally broke through." Bram's hands shook slightly as he plugged in the drive. The footage was grainy but clear enough. He watched as Maria met with a man in the service entrance, the same man who would later enter Mabel's room. Money changed hands. Instructions were given. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. "The elevator cameras, the hallway angles, it was all staged, Mr. Benson, every moment of it." "Why?" The question came out as a whisper. Why would Maria? But even as he asked, he knew. The pieces were falling into place. Maria's sudden expensive jewelry, her frequent calls to someone she claimed was her nephew, the way she'd pushed him to believe the worst about Mabel. "Find her," he ordered. "Find Maria, now!" Back in Baltimore, Mabel was settling into a routine with the twins. Her design firm had been surprisingly accommodating, allowing her to work primarily from home. She'd converted half of her living room into an office, where she could sketch and plan while keeping an eye on the girls. Hope and Grace were 3 months old now, their personalities already distinct. Hope was the adventurer. always trying to roll over, to reach for things just beyond her grasp. Grace was the observer, taking in the world with thoughtful eyes, saving her smiles for special moments. "You're just like your father," Mabel whispered to Hope one night, watching her struggle against sleep, always pushing boundaries, never wanting to miss a moment. Then to Grace, who was already drifting off, "And you, my sweet girl, you think everything through just like he used to." The admission hurt less these days. She'd learned to separate the man she'd married from the stranger he'd become, to cherish the good memories while accepting the painful end. But fate had other plans. In a small cafe in Queens, Maria Delgado's hands shook as she stirred her coffee. Across from her, Detective James Chen, Sarah's husband, waited patiently. "Start from the beginning," he said gently. "Tell me everything." Maria's story spilled out like poison from an old wound. The mysterious woman who'd approached her at church, offering money to help destroy Mabel's marriage. The carefully orchestrated scenes, the doctored photos, the whispered lies in Bram's ear. "But why?" James pressed. "Who was behind it?" Maria's next words would change everything. She said she was Mr. Benson's first love, from before his parents died, that Mrs. Mabel had stolen him, that she was just helping things return to how they should be. James frowned. This woman, did she have a name? "Victoria," Maria whispered. "Victoria Chase." Meanwhile, in Baltimore, Mabel was preparing for the twins' first pediatrician visit. As she packed the diaper bag, a knock at the door made her pause. "Mrs. Thompson?" an unfamiliar voice called. "Package delivery." Something in the tone made her instincts flare. She moved silently to the security panel Mr. Rodriguez had installed, checking the camera feed. Her heart stopped. The man at her door wasn't a delivery person. He was the same private investigator she'd spotted following her in New York, just before she'd fled. With trembling hands, she pressed the panic button that would alert both Mr. Rodriguez and the police. Then she gathered the twins, one in each arm, and moved quickly to the bathroom. The only room without windows, the safe room they'd prepared for just such a moment. As she sat in the dark, holding her daughters close, Mabel could hear muffled voices outside. Mr. Rodriguez's deep baritone, angry and protective. Police sirens in the distance. "It's okay, my loves," she whispered to the twins, who somehow remained peacefully asleep. "Mama's here. No one will ever hurt you." But even as she said the words, she knew her carefully constructed peace was ending. The past was catching up, and this time she couldn't run, not with two babies depending on her. Back in New York, Bram sat in his parked car outside Victoria Chase's Upper East Side townhouse, the security footage playing on his phone for the 100th time. 20 years ago, she'd been his first love, his anchor after his parents' death. They'd drifted apart as he built his empire, but he'd never suspected she could orchestrate something so cruel. His phone buzzed. A text from Detective Chen. "Got Maria's confession, full story, call me." Another buzz. "Found her, boss," from his private investigator. "Baltimore. But there's something you should know." A third message, this one from Margaret. "DNA test results from the hospital, confirming twins. They're yours." Bram's world tilted on its axis. In one moment, everything he'd believed for the past year crumbled. Every suspicious thought, every cruel word he'd thrown at Mabel, every moment he'd missed with his children, all based on lies. "Oh, God," he whispered into the darkness of his car. "What have I done?" But even as the truth came to light in New York back in Baltimore, Mabel was making a decision that would change everything. As the police led the private investigator away, as her neighbors gathered protectively around her door, as her daughters slept peacefully in their carriers, she knew she couldn't hide anymore. It was time to face the past, not for herself, not for Bram, but for two innocent girls who deserved to know their whole story, no matter how painful its chapters might be. What she couldn't know, as she picked up her phone to finally call Sarah, was that Bram was already on his way to Baltimore, his heart full of terrible knowledge and desperate hope. The truth was unraveling on both ends, racing toward a confrontation that would either heal old wounds or create new ones too deep to fathom. In their cribs, Hope and Grace slept on, unaware that their world was about to change forever. For better or worse, only time would tell. Chapter 8. When Truth Comes Home. Baltimore's spring rain fell in sheets as Bram Benson's car wound through the unfamiliar streets of Hampton. The GPS directed him toward a modest brick building, so different from the luxury he'd once provided Mabel. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, Victoria's confession still ringing in his ears. 2 hours earlier, he'd confronted her in her Upper East Side townhouse. The truth had spilled from her like poison. "You were mine first," she'd said, her perfect composure finally cracking. "We were meant to be together, until she came along with her warmth and her charm, making everyone fall in love with her. I just wanted things back the way they were." "So you orchestrated her destruction," Bram had replied, his voice deadly quiet. "You paid Maria, hired the photographer, planted the seeds of doubt." "You were already doubting her," Victoria shot back. "The late nights at work, the mysterious phone calls, those were my doing too. Every time you called her office, my friend would say she'd just stepped out. Every time you checked her phone, you'd find mysterious numbers I'd arranged. I just helped you see what you were afraid was already there." The confession had left him reeling. Every cruel word he'd thrown at Mabel, every suspicious thought, every moment of coldness, all manufactured by a woman he'd once loved, playing on his deepest insecurities. Now, sitting in his parked car outside Mabel's building, he watched through the rain as lights came on in various windows. Which one was hers? Which window sheltered the children he'd never met, his daughters, whose existence he'd cruelly doubted? Movement caught his eye. A small, elderly Asian woman was hurrying through the rain with an umbrella and what appeared to be a covered dish. She paused at the building's entrance, studying him with suspicious eyes. Mrs. Chen had been watching for him. After Mabel's frightened call about the private investigator, the entire building had been on alert. She recognized Bram from the photos Mabel kept hidden in a drawer, photos she looked at late at night when she thought no one was watching. Instead of entering the building, Mrs. Chen approached his car, tapping firmly on the window. Bram lowered it, rain spattering his face. I know who you are," she cut him off. "Question is, do you?" The directness caught him off guard. "I need to see them," he said quietly. "Please." "Why?" "To hurt them again." Her eyes were fierce with protective love. "Those babies sleep peaceful now." Mabel smiled again. "Why you come to break that?" "Because I was wrong," Bram's voice cracked. "Because I was deceived and I betrayed the only woman I've ever truly loved. Because somewhere in that building are 2 little girls who share my blood, and I've missed so much already." Mrs. Chen studied him for a long moment. "Come," she finally said. "But remember, you break them again, you deal with me." The threat coming from this tiny woman clutching a dish of dumplings might have been amusing in other circumstances. But Bram recognized the fierce love of someone who had chosen to be family. He followed her silently into the building. Mabel was singing softly to the twins, an old lullaby her mother used to sing, when the knock came. Hope was fighting sleep as usual, while Grace watched with her thoughtful eyes. "Come in, Mrs. Chen," she called, recognizing the familiar pattern of knocks. But when she opened the door, the covered dish of dumplings wasn't what made her gasp. Bram stood there, rain-soaked and haunted, looking at her as if she were a mirage that might vanish. Behind him, Mrs. Chen stood like a tiny guardian angel, her expression both worried and hopeful. "Mabel," he breathed, and in that one word was a universe of regret, of love, of desperate hope. She instinctively moved to close the door, but Hope chose that moment to let out a demanding cry. Bram's eyes widened at the sound, and Mabel saw him sway slightly. "Please," he whispered. "Please let me explain." Mrs. Chen touched Mabel's arm gently. "I stay," she said firmly. "You talk." Something in her neighbor's steady presence gave Mabel strength. She stepped back, allowing them to enter. The twins were in their playpen, Hope now fully awake and curious about the newcomer, Grace watching with her usual careful consideration. Bram stopped dead when he saw them, his face draining of color. "They're—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "Your daughters," Mabel supplied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Hope and Grace." He moved closer, dropping to his knees beside the playpen. Hope immediately reached for him, fearless as always. Grace tucked herself closer to her sister, uncertain. "They have my eyes," he said wonderingly, tears streaming down his face. "Hope has your smile too," Mabel said softly, "and your determination. Grace thinks everything through, just like you used to." The "used to" hit him like a physical blow. "Mabel, I was wrong, so terribly wrong. Victoria—" "I know about Victoria," she cut him off. "Sarah told me everything." "Then you know I was manipulated. But that's no excuse. I should have trusted you. Should have listened when you tried to tell me about the babies. Should have—" Hope chose that moment to grab his finger, her tiny hand wrapping around it with surprising strength. The simple gesture broke him completely. Sobs racked his body as he knelt there, connected to his daughter for the first time. Mrs. Chen quietly withdrew to the kitchen, giving them space while remaining within earshot. "I understand why it happened," Mabel said after a long moment. "Victoria played on every insecurity, orchestrated every doubt. But Bram, you chose to believe the worst of me. After everything we'd been through, everything I'd sacrificed for you." "The estate," he whispered. "You gave up your inheritance to save my company, and I repaid you with cruelty." "It wasn't about the money," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "It was about trust, about faith, about believing in us." Grace had begun to edge closer, curiosity overcoming caution. Bram stayed perfectly still, watching as his younger daughter studied him with eyes so like his own. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I don't deserve it. But these girls, they deserve to know their father. Please, let me try to make amends. Let me be part of their lives." Mabel looked at her daughters. Hope fearlessly holding her father's finger, Grace cautiously considering this new presence in their world. She thought about the past year, about the community that had embraced her, about the strength she'd found in starting over. "I won't leave Baltimore," she said firmly. "This is our home now. These people are our family." "Then I'll move here," he replied without hesitation. "I'll open a Baltimore office. Anything, Mabel. Just, please don't shut me out of their lives." Mrs. Chen's voice carried from the kitchen, where she was pretending not to listen. Man must prove himself worthy of family he abandoned. Bram turned toward her voice. "Yes," he agreed. "I must. I will." Grace finally reached out, touching his wet sleeve with one tiny finger. Hope was trying to pull herself up using his hand for support. The sight of her daughters connecting with their father made Mabel's heart ache with both joy and fear. "We take it slow," she finally said, "very slow. You can visit them, spend time with them, but you need to understand, things can never be like they were before." "I know," he said softly. "I don't expect them to be. I just want a chance to know my daughters, to show you that I can be worthy of being in their lives." As if understanding the gravity of the moment, both twins chose that instant to smile at their father. Hope's smile was big and fearless, Grace's smaller but equally genuine. Bram's tears fell on their tiny hands as he gently touched each of their faces. Mrs. Chen reappeared with tea and her dumplings. "Family complicated," she announced, setting everything down. Take time, take patience, but babies need father, if father prove worthy. The emphasis on if was clear. Bram nodded, understanding that he had a long road ahead of him. Outside, the rain had stopped. Through the window, a rainbow arched across the Baltimore sky, a symbol of hope after the storm. Mabel watched as Bram carefully interacted with their daughters, seeing both the man she'd loved and the stranger he'd become, wondering if there was a path forward through all the pain. What she couldn't know then was that this moment would mark the beginning of a different kind of journey. Not the fairy tale romance they'd once shared, but something more complex, more real. A story of redemption, of second chances, of learning to rebuild trust one tiny piece at a time. For now, though, she simply watched her daughters discover their father, while Mrs. Chen kept careful watch over them all, guardian of this fragile new beginning. Chapter 9. The Space Between Forgiveness. The courtroom was silent, except for the gentle whir of the air conditioning. Judge Patricia Martinez looked down from her bench at the family before her. Bram in an impeccable suit that couldn't hide his exhaustion, Mabel elegant but guarded in navy blue, and between them the twins in matching pale yellow dresses, unaware of the gravity of the moment. "Mr. Benson," the judge began, "you're petitioning for joint custody of Hope and Grace Benson, now 6 months old. Given the circumstances of their mother's departure from New York and your initial denial of paternity, why should this court grant your request?" Bram stood, his hands trembling slightly. The past week of custody hearings had stripped away his corporate armor, leaving him raw and exposed. "Your Honor," his voice cracked before he steadied it, "I stand before you today not as the CEO of Benson Enterprises, but as a man who made terrible mistakes. I was manipulated, yes, but I chose to believe lies about the most honest person I've ever known. I abandoned my wife when she was carrying our children. There's no excuse that can make that right." He turned to look at Mabel, at the twins sleeping peacefully in their stroller. But those little girls, they deserved to know their father. Not the man I was when I let fear and suspicion poison my heart, but the man I'm trying to become, the man who will spend every day of his life trying to be worthy of them. Judge Martinez leaned forward. "Mrs. Benson." "Ms. Bennett," Mabel corrected quietly. She had resumed using her maiden name in Baltimore. "Ms. Bennett, you've indicated a willingness to consider joint custody, despite your initial resistance. What changed?" Mabel stood, unconsciously straightening her spine. "Hope laughed yesterday," she said softly. "A real laugh, her first one. She was watching Bram make silly faces at her. And Grace, who's so careful with strangers, she reached for him. They deserve the chance to know their father's love." Her voice strengthened. "But, Your Honor, I need protection, not just for myself, but for them. I've built a life in Baltimore. We have a community there, people who became family when we had none. I won't uproot my daughters from the only home they've known." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Benson, you've purchased property in Baltimore?" "Yes, Your Honor. A small house 3 blocks from Mabel's apartment. I'm opening a Baltimore office of Benson Enterprises. My life will be wherever my daughters are." From her seat in the gallery, Mrs. Chen watched with sharp eyes. She had insisted on coming to court, declaring herself the twins' honorary grandmother. Now she nodded approvingly at Bram's words. Judge Martinez reviewed the papers before her. "I have here the full investigation report concerning the events in New York. Ms. Victoria Chase's confession, Mrs. Delgado's testimony, the photographic evidence of manipulation. Mr. Benson, you were indeed the victim of an elaborate deception. However," she fixed him with a stern gaze, "you chose to believe the worst about your wife. You rejected her attempts to tell you about your children. Those choices were yours alone." "Yes, Your Honor," Bram whispered. "Ms. Bennett, You've demonstrated remarkable strength and resilience. The court recognizes your right to maintain your residence in Baltimore. Mr. Benson's commitment to relocating shows genuine dedication to his children's welfare." The judge sat back. "Here is my ruling. Joint custody will be granted, with primary physical custody remaining with Miss Bennett. Mr. Benson will have visitation rights that increase gradually over the next 6 months, contingent upon his continued residence in Baltimore and completion of family counseling sessions." She looked at both parents. "This arrangement is probationary. In 6 months, we'll review the situation. Any attempt to remove the children from Baltimore without mutual consent will result in immediate revision of custody terms." Hope stirred in the stroller, her tiny face scrunching as she woke. Without thinking, both Mabel and Bram moved to comfort her. Their hands brushed as they reached for their daughter, and for a moment the old electricity sparked between them. Mabel pulled back first. "She needs to eat," she said softly. May I come with you?" Bram asked. "Just to spend a little more time with them." Mrs. Chen appeared beside them. "You come all. I make lunch. Babies need food. Parents need talk." The judge watched this interaction with approval. "Court is adjourned. I'll see you all in 6 months." Outside the courthouse, spring was in full bloom. The twins were fully awake now, Hope reaching eagerly for her father, while Grace observed everything with her thoughtful eyes. "They're starting to show their personalities more each day," Mabel said as they walked toward Mrs. Chen's car. "Hope never wants to miss anything. Grace takes her time, figures things out first." "Like their mother," Bram said softly. "You always could see the heart of things." Mabel looked at him sharply. "Don't, Bram. We're not there yet. Maybe we'll never be there again." "I know." He adjusted Hope in his arms as she grabbed for his tie. "But Mabel, thank you for giving me this chance with them. I know I don't deserve it." Mrs. Chen snorted from ahead of them. "Man speak too much of deserve, not enough of prove. Actions speak louder than grand words." In her arms, Grace smiled one of her rare smiles at the old woman's tone. Mabel couldn't help but laugh, her first real laugh in Bram's presence since everything had fallen apart. The sound made him stop walking, staring at her with such longing that she had to look away. "One day at a time," she said quietly. "That's all any of us can do." Back at Mrs. Chen's apartment, the old woman set about preparing an elaborate lunch while the twins played on a blanket. Bram sat on the floor with them, completely unself-conscious about his expensive suit, letting Hope crawl all over him while trying to coax similar boldness from Grace. Mabel watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart a tangle of emotions. This man who had shattered her world was also the father of her children, the man she had once loved beyond reason. Watching him with their daughters, so gentle, so patient, she could almost see the person she'd married. "Heart take time to heal," Mrs. Chen said beside her, chopping vegetables with swift precision. "But babies need whole family, not broken pieces." "I don't know if I can ever trust him again," Mabel whispered. "Trust like garden," Mrs. Chen replied. "Must prepare soil, plant seeds, tend every day, cannot rush growth." On the blanket, Grace had finally ventured closer to her father, attracted by the silly voices he was making at Hope. When she reached for him, his eyes filled with tears. "Hello, my careful girl," he said softly, holding perfectly still as she explored his face with tiny fingers. "Take all the time you need. Daddy's not going anywhere." The simple promise, spoken to a baby but meant for all of them, hung in the air. Mabel felt tears spring to her own eyes as she watched Grace's tiny hand pat her father's cheek, while Hope snuggled contentedly in his other arm. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined to their love story, but perhaps it was the beginning of a different kind of story. One about healing, about second chances, about learning to trust again, not in grand gestures, but in small moments like this. Outside Mrs. Chen's window, Baltimore continued its daily rhythm. Inside, 4 broken pieces of a family began the slow, careful work of finding a new way to be whole. Chapter 10. Bridges over troubled waters. The winter storm had come without warning, blanketing Baltimore in thick snow and dangerous ice. Mabel paced her apartment, checking her phone for the 100th time. No signal. The power had been out for hours, and the twins were getting fussy in the growing cold. "Shh, my darlings," she whispered, wrapping them in another layer of blankets. At 8 months old, they were more aware of discomfort, more vocal about their displeasure. Hope was fighting against her swaddling while Grace whimpered softly, picking up on her mother's anxiety. A knock at the door made her jump. Mrs. Chen's familiar voice called out, "Mabel, you okay?" She opened the door to find not just Mrs. Chen, but Bram as well, their faces illuminated by flashlight beams. He was covered in snow, his usual corporate polish replaced by practical winter gear. "The roads are impossible," he said, stepping in and immediately assessing the situation. "The whole city's shut down. I was checking the Baltimore office when the storm hit. Mrs. Chen called me when the power went out here. The babies need warmth," Mrs. Chen announced. "My building has generator, all neighbors gathering in community room. You come now." Mabel hesitated. In the 6 weeks since the custody hearing, she and Bram had maintained careful boundaries. He visited the twins daily, but always with others present, always with the protective buffer of formality between them. But now, watching Hope shiver despite her blankets, she knew they had no choice. "Let me take them," Bram offered, already moving toward the twins. "You grab whatever supplies they'll need." His competence with the babies still surprised her sometimes. He lifted them both with practiced ease, tucking them securely against his chest. Hope immediately grabbed his scarf, while Grace nestled into his warmth. The trek to Mrs. Chen's building was treacherous. Bram walked backward, shielding the twins from the biting wind with his body, while Mabel clutched Mrs. Chen's arm for balance on the ice. The community room was warm and crowded. Their neighbors had created a makeshift shelter, sharing food and blankets. Mr. Rodriguez had his radio working, providing updates on the storm. Katie from 4C was organizing sleeping arrangements. "Over here!" Mrs. Chen directed them to a corner she'd already prepared with cushions and blankets. "Babies need space." As they settled in, Mabel noticed how naturally Bram fit into this community she'd built. He chatted with Mr. Rodriguez about the generator's fuel levels, accepted a thermos of soup from Katie with genuine gratitude, listened to Mrs. Chen's instructions about keeping the twins warm with respectful attention. Hours passed. The storm raged outside while inside. Their neighbors created pockets of warmth and comfort. Someone started singing old songs that everyone seemed to know. The twins, fed and warm, drifted to sleep in their shared portable crib. "They look so peaceful," Bram whispered, watching their daughters sleep. "Like angels." "Until Hope decides she's done sleeping," Mabel smiled. "Then she's more like a tiny tornado. Like me as a baby, according to my mother's diaries." His voice caught on the memory. "I found them recently, while clearing out my parents' things. Finally ready to face those boxes after all these years." Mabel remembered how he'd avoided his grief after his parents' death, throwing himself into work instead. "What else did you find?" "Letters they wrote to each other, photos, their love story." He paused, looking at her in the dim light. "They weathered storms too, you know. Had times when they almost lost each other." "What happened?" "They chose to fight for each other. Every day, every storm. They chose love over pride, healing over hurt." He looked down at their sleeping daughters. "I didn't understand then what that meant. To choose love even when it's hard. To trust even when you're afraid." A particularly strong gust rattled the windows. Grace stirred, and they both reached to soothe her. Their hands met over her tiny back, and this time, neither pulled away. "I miss you," Bram said softly. Not just what we were, but who we were. I miss my best friend. Tears sprang to Mabel's eyes. I miss you too. But Bram, I'm not the same person anymore. That woman who trusted completely, who believed in fairy tales. She died the day you chose to believe lies over her love. I know. His voice was rough with emotion. And I'm not the same man either. The one who let fear poison his heart, who forgot what real love looks like. He died too, the day I realized what I'd lost. Hope made a small sound in her sleep, reaching out until her tiny hand found her sister's. Even in sleep, they sought each other. Look at them, Mabel whispered. They know somehow. They know they're stronger together. Like their mother, Mrs. Chen's voice came from behind them. She set down fresh tea, her wise eyes taking in their tearful faces. Strong enough to protect, strong enough to forgive. When ready. The old woman's words hung in the air between them. Outside, the storm began to ease, snow replacing the freezing rain. I've been seeing a therapist, Bram said suddenly, not just the court-mandated family counseling, personal therapy, trying to understand why I let Victoria manipulate me, why I was so ready to believe the worst. Mabel looked at him with surprise. The Bram she'd known would never have admitted to needing help. What have you learned? She asked softly. That I never dealt with losing my parents. That I was so afraid of being abandoned again, I pushed you away first. That love isn't about control or certainty, it's about faith. And I lost faith not just in you, but in myself. A cry from the portable crib interrupted them. Hope was awake and demanding attention. They moved together automatically, a dance they'd perfected over the past weeks. Bram changed her while Mabel prepared a bottle, their movements synchronized, despite everything. As Hope drank her bottle, her tiny hand wrapped around both their fingers where they held the bottle together. Grace woke too, not crying but watching them with those wise eyes that seemed to see everything. Remember our first date? Mabel asked suddenly, when you said each light in the city was a story. I remember everything about that night, Bram replied. The way you looked in the moonlight, how your hand felt in mine, the hope in my heart. Our story isn't that one anymore, she said gently. We can't go back to that fairy tale, but maybe... She hesitated, looking at their daughters, at their joined hands on Hope's bottle. Maybe we can write a new one. Not about perfect love, but about real love. About healing and growth and choosing each other every day. Grace chose that moment to reach for them, unwilling to be left out. Bram lifted her with his free arm, and suddenly they were huddled together, a family circle in the dim light of a storm shelter. I choose you, Bram whispered. All of you. Every day, every storm, every moment. Not because of who we were, but because of who we are now. Who we could be. Mabel looked at their daughters, at this man who was both familiar and new, at the community that had gathered around them in crisis. The walls around her heart didn't crumble. They had been built too carefully for that. But perhaps, just perhaps, a window opened. One day at a time, she said softly. We learn to trust again. We learn to love again. Not like before, but maybe better. Hope smiled around her bottle, while Grace patted both their faces with tiny hands, as if blessing this moment of understanding. Outside, the storm was passing. Dawn would bring a world transformed by snow, familiar landscapes made new by nature's hand. Inside, another kind of transformation was beginning, slower, more careful, but just as profound. And in that warm room, surrounded by community and wrapped in the love of their daughters, Mabel and Bram began to write the first words of their new story. Not a fairy tale, but something stronger, a tale of redemption, of second chances, of love that grows not from perfect soil, but from the cracks in broken hearts, reaching toward the light. Chapter 11. Love's Second Spring. The rooftop garden of Mabel's design firm glowed with hundreds of tiny lights. It was the twins' first birthday celebration, and the space had been transformed into an enchanted wonderland. Paper lanterns swayed in the gentle June breeze, while mason jars filled with fireflies created living constellations among the flower beds Mabel had planted. Hope and Grace, dressed in matching pale blue dresses, were the center of attention. Hope toddled fearlessly between guests, charming everyone with her infectious laugh, while Grace observed from her perch in Mrs. Chen's lap, occasionally offering her mysterious half-smile to those who earned her trust. "They're so different," Sarah remarked, watching the twins, "like sun and moon." "Both lighting the world in their own way," Bram added softly, appearing beside them with fresh drinks. The past 5 months since the winter storm had brought subtle but significant changes. The careful distance between Bram and Mabel had gradually softened, replaced by something new, not the passionate whirlwind of their first love, but a deeper understanding born of shared pain and healing. "Cake time," Katie announced, bringing out an elaborate confection decorated with butterflies and flowers. As everyone gathered around, Mabel found herself standing next to Bram. The twins sat in their special chairs, eyes wide at the glowing candles. Hope was already reaching for the frosting, while Grace studied the flames with fascination. "Make wish," Mrs. Chen commanded, her camera ready. Mabel and Bram leaned down together, helping the girls blow out their candles. Their faces were close, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. But this wasn't the past. It was something new, something they were building day by day. Later, after the cake had been demolished, mostly by Hope, and the guests had begun to drift away, Bram touched Mabel's elbow gently. "Walk with me?" he asked. "There's something I want to show you." The rooftop garden had been Mabel's latest project, transforming the industrial space into an urban oasis. Now, in the twilight, it felt magical. Bram led her to a quiet corner where a new bench sat beneath a pergola dripping with wisteria. "I had this installed last week," he said. "A birthday gift for all of us, really. Look ... He pointed upward. Through the twining vines, the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "Remember our spot in Central Park?" he asked softly. "Where we used to watch the stars?" "Before the city lights got too bright," Mabel nodded. "When we could still see Cassiopeia." "They said the Queen's chair," they said together, then laughed at the shared memory. "Mabel," Bram's voice grew serious, "this past year has taught me more about love than all the years before. Watching you with our daughters, seeing how you've built this beautiful life here, understanding the strength it took to start over." He took a small box from his pocket. Mabel's heart jumped, but when he opened it, it wasn't a ring inside. It was a delicate compass, antique silver with mother-of-pearl inlay. "This belonged to my mother," he explained. "She gave it to my father when they were young, lost in their own storms. She told him that true love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about finding your way back to each other, no matter how far you've wandered." Tears sparkled in Mabel's eyes as he placed the compass in her hands. "I'm not asking for what we had before," he continued. "That chapter is written, finished. But these past months, watching you, learning from you, growing with you, I've fallen in love all over again, not with the memory of who you were, but with who you are now, stronger, wiser, more beautiful in your truth than ever before." A shooting star streaked across the visible patch of sky, as if blessing his words. "I make you new promises," he said softly, "not the fairy tale vows of before, but real promises earned through pain and growth. I promise to listen, not just to your words, but to your silences. I promise to trust, not blindly, but with eyes and heart wide open. I promise to cherish each moment of grace you give me, each smile you share, each step we take together. Mabel traced the compass's delicate markings, feeling the weight of history in her hands. And if we lose our way again, then we find it together, he replied. No more running, no more hiding. We face the storms side by side. From inside came the sound of Hope's laughter, followed by Grace's softer giggles. The voices of their community, Mrs. Chen's wisdom, Katie's enthusiasm, Mr. Rodriguez's gentle humor, created a symphony of belonging. I can't promise you forever, Mabel said finally, but I can promise you today and tomorrow and the day after that, one day at a time, we build something new. Bram took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm like he used to do. That's all I ask. A chance to write a new story together. Not a fairy tale, but a true tale, with all its complications and imperfections and moments of unexpected beauty. Above them, the wisteria swayed in the evening breeze, its perfume mingling with the night air. The fireflies in their jars created a gentle glow like earthbound stars. Dance with me? Bram asked softly. Like we used to, under the stars. Mabel hesitated only a moment before stepping into his arms. They swayed together to music only they could hear, the compass pressed between their hearts. From the doorway, Mrs. Chen watched with satisfied eyes. Hope had fallen asleep in her arms, while Grace observed her parents with her thoughtful gaze. See, Mrs. Chen whispered to the girls, love not always straight line. Sometimes take scenic route, but find way home eventually. As if understanding, Grace smiled her rare, full smile. On the rooftop, under a canopy of stars and wisteria, surrounded by the life they had built from broken pieces, Mabel and Bram continued their dance. Not the passionate waltz of their first love, but a gentler rhythm, one that spoke of understanding, of forgiveness, of love that grows stronger for having been tested. The compass between them pointed not north but home, and home, they were learning, wasn't a place at all. It was this moment, this understanding, this careful choreography of hearts, learning to beat in time once more. Chapter 12. When Love Finds Its Way Home, 20 years later. The Baltimore headquarters of Benson Enterprises gleamed in the morning sun, its innovative green architecture a testament to the company's evolution. In the dual CEO offices on the top floor, Hope and Grace Benson, now 21, stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows their mother had designed 2 decades ago. Hard to believe it all started with a collision in Central Park, Hope mused, adjusting her blazer. Her dark hair and confident stance mirrored her father's, while her warm eyes held her mother's kindness. Grace, arranging fresh flowers in their mother's favorite vase, smiled her characteristic thoughtful smile. And now here we are, running the company together. The sisters had inherited not just their parents' business acumen, but the lessons of their love story. Hope had their father's drive tempered by their mother's compassion, while Grace possessed Mabel's artistic vision balanced by Bram's strategic mind. Girls? Mabel's voice came from the doorway. At 53, she was still stunning, silver threads in her auburn hair catching the light. Your father's waiting in the garden. The rooftop garden, Mabel's first major project in Baltimore, had become a sanctuary for the family. Over 2 decades, it had witnessed countless moments of their journey. Family picnics, heart-to-heart talks, celebrations, and quiet moments of healing. They found Bram by the wisteria-covered pergola, now a massive cascade of purple blooms. At 55, his hair was more silver than black, but his eyes still held the same intensity when he looked at his family. Perfect timing, he smiled, gesturing to the setup before him. A familiar bench, weathered by 20 years of seasons, had been decorated with fairy lights. Mason jars filled with fireflies, a tradition since the twins' first birthday, created a magical atmosphere even in daylight. "Mom, Dad," Hope started, her usual confidence wavering with emotion. "Grace and I wanted to do something special for your 20th anniversary of finding each other again." Grace stepped forward, carrying an intricately carved wooden box. "We found this while organizing the old office files. Inside lay photos, letters, and mementos of their parents' journey, the antique compass that had symbolized their new beginning, pressed flowers from the rooftop garden, pictures of tiny twins being held by a younger Bram and Mabel, their faces showing both fear and hope. "But that's not all," Hope continued. "We've gathered everyone who was part of your story." As if on cue, familiar faces emerged from behind the garden's greenery. Sarah, her hair now grey, but her smile as bright as ever. Katie from 4C, now a successful artist. Mr. Rodriguez, retired but still fixing things around the building. And most importantly, Mrs. Chen, now in her 90s but still sharp as ever, supported by her great-granddaughter. Mrs. Chen declared, settling into a chair of honor. 20 years watching love grow back stronger, like garden after storm, more beautiful for surviving." Mabel felt tears well up as she looked at the gathered faces, their chosen family, the community that had helped them rebuild when everything seemed lost. Bram took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her palm. "Remember what you promised me here, under these same stars, one day at a time. 7,300 days, she smiled. Each one a choice to love, to trust, to grow together. Grace, ever the observer, had set up a projector. Images began playing on a screen between the plants, their story told in photographs. The painful early days in Baltimore, the winter storm that began to thaw their hearts, the twins' first birthday when promises were renewed, countless moments of their rebuilt life together. "You taught us what real love looks like," Hope said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not the fairy tale kind, but the kind that works through hard times, that chooses to stay, to fight, to forgive. The kind that's stronger for being broken and rebuilt," Grace added softly. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Love like good soup. Take time, need right ingredients, must tend carefully. Sometimes burn tongue first time, but learn to blow cooling breath, wait for right moment." Everyone laughed, familiar with Mrs. Chen's wisdom wrapped in metaphors. "We have one more surprise," the twins announced together. They unveiled a plaque to be installed in the garden, the Benson Bennett Healing Garden, where love finds its way home. Dedicated to Mabel and Bram, who taught us that true love isn't about perfect moments, but perfect effort. And to their daughters, Hope and Grace, named for the two things every love story needs. Bram pulled Mabel close, their years together reflected in how perfectly they still fit. "You know," he whispered, "that day in Central Park wasn't an accident." "Oh." The universe knew exactly what it was doing, sending me someone strong enough to survive my storms, wise enough to teach me about real love, and brave enough to give second chances. Mabel touched the compass that still hung around her neck. "And sending me someone who would learn to find his way back home, no matter how far he wandered." As their family and friends celebrated around them, as their daughters beamed with pride and love, as Mrs. Chen dispensed more soup-related wisdom to anyone who would listen, Mabel and Bram shared a look that held 20 years of understanding. Their love story hadn't been perfect. It had been real, full of mistakes and healing, of hard choices and harder forgiveness, of moments both bitter and sweet. But perhaps that was the greatest lesson they had learned and passed on to their daughters. That love isn't about avoiding the storms, but about learning to dance in the rain together. Hope raised her glass. "To Mom and Dad, who showed us that every ending can be a new beginning." Grace added softly, and that the best love stories aren't written in fairy tales, but in the hearts of people brave enough to try again. As the sun set over Baltimore, painting the sky in the same colors that had witnessed their first reunion, Mabel and Bram held each other close, their daughters strong and confident in their own paths, their community bonds strengthened by time and trust, their love tested by fire and stronger for the forging. In the gathering twilight, fireflies began to rise from their jars, creating a dance of living light. Just like 20 years ago, a shooting star streaked across the sky, nature's own celebration of love's endurance. "One more day?" Bram asked softly, echoing their daily promise. "One more day," Mabel answered, her heart full of gratitude for this imperfect, beautiful life they had built together. And in that moment, surrounded by the fruits of their love and labor, they were home, not in a place, but in each other's hearts, where they had always belonged. The end. When hearts break and rise again. Lessons from Mabel's journey. Dear reader, if you've followed Mabel's story with a heavy heart because it mirrors your own, know that you are not alone. Her journey from betrayal to rebuilding carries precious wisdom for anyone who has faced the shattering of trust and love. The lessons we learn: 1. Your worth is not defined by another's mistakes. Mabel's strength wasn't in never being hurt, but in refusing to let betrayal define her. She rebuilt her life, not to prove anything to Bram, but to create security for herself and her children. Your value remains undiminished by someone else's failure to see it too. Building a support system is crucial. Notice how Mabel found family in strangers. Mrs. Chen, Katie, Mr. Rodriguez. They became her strength when she had none. Don't be afraid to let people in. Sometimes angels come disguised as neighbors. 3. Success is the best response. Mabel didn't let grief consume her. She built a new career, raised her children, created a beautiful life. Your happiness is not dependent on those who hurt you. Focus on growing stronger, wiser, more fulfilled. 4. Forgiveness is optional. Healing is essential. Mabel's journey shows that healing comes first. Forgiveness, if it comes, must be earned through consistent actions, not just words. You don't owe anyone your trust. It must be rebuilt slowly, deliberately. 5. Love can come again. Whether with the same person who hurt you, if they truly change like Bram, or someone new. But first, fall in love with your own strength. Let any future love be based on who you've become, not who you were for those still in pain. If you're reading this with fresh wounds, remember, your tears are valid, your anger is justified, your healing is possible, your future is bright, your heart will beat strongly again. Take inspiration from Mabel's choice to put herself first, build a support system, focus on growth, set clear boundaries, trust her instincts, demand respect. A special note about reconciliation. If, like Mabel and Bram, there's a possibility of reconciliation, demand complete honesty, require consistent change, establish firm boundaries, trust actions over words, take it slow, keep your independence, never compromise your self-respect. For all strong hearts. Remember, you are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become because of it. Your story isn't over. Like Mabel, you can write a new chapter, one where you are stronger, wiser, and more authentically yourself than ever before. To stay connected with more stories of hope and healing, and to receive regular inspiration for your own journey, subscribe to our newsletter for weekly wisdom. Join our supportive community of survivors. Access resources for healing and growth. Receive updates on new stories and insights. Connect with others who understand your journey. Remember, like Mabel, you deserve a love that doesn't require you to sacrifice your dignity. Whether that love comes from healing an old relationship or building something new, Make sure it honors the strong, beautiful person you are becoming. Your journey matters. Your healing matters. Your happiness matters. With hope and solidarity, join our community of strong hearts, rebuilding beautiful lives. Together we rise, together we heal, together we create stories of triumph. Subscribe if you liked it. God bless you. Thanks for your precious time. We will meet you tomorrow at 2 p.m.